For centuries, we believed Vikings survived the Arctic with fur and fire alone. But in Greenland, archaeologists uncovered something that defies logic. Homes that stayed at 18 degrees Celsius without heating, built only with dirt, grass, and stone. How did this system work, and why did we abandon it just when we needed it most? Chapter 1. The discovery that changed everything. A sharp Arctic wind lashes the edge of the fjord. Waves crash against stone outcrops. The silence is ancient, uninterrupted. It was in a place like this, on the western edge of the Old Norse colony of Brattahlid, founded around the year 985 after Christ by Eric the Red in southern Greenland, where archaeologists uncovered traces of something that defied all logic. Homes that had lasted for hundreds of years in one of the most extreme environments on Earth. The discovery began with nothing more than shallow impressions in the grass, faint outlines of walls and turf where a large house once stood. Radiocarbon dating confirmed the site was occupied between the 10th and 15th centuries, when Norse settlement in Greenland thrived, then slowly declined. But what made this Viking house different from all others? The secret was in its location, its materials, and a design that seemed to contradict the brutal cold. Positioned deep within a fjord and shielded from the harsh ocean wind, the structure was able to capture hours of low-angle Arctic sunlight even during winter. Brattahlid lies 96 kilometers inland, protected by the fjord's natural geography. The outer walls of the main building measured up to 1.5 meters thick, constructed from layered stone and turf, as confirmed by excavation records. Archaeologists also found floors paved with flat stones, and in one case, what appeared to be a stable floor, a raised platform used for livestock, suggesting humans and animals shared the same enclosed space for warmth. One of the most remarkable findings at the site was evidence of an early form of water-based heating and moisture control. Studies on domestic Viking-era dwellings describe raised flooring systems and chimneyless hearths designed to regulate interior temperature and humidity. As archaeologists dug deeper into the collapsed turf walls, they noticed something unusual. The turf used as insulation still contained organic matter, grass, moss, roots, deliberately layered to retain heat and moisture. Instead of sealing out the cold completely, the structure managed to create a warm microclimate that was stable, breathable, and effective. For anyone entering one of these longhouses, the shift in atmosphere would have been immediate and sensory. Outside, the wind howled. Inside, the turf absorbed sound. The stone floors radiated low, lingering heat from animals and perhaps a central fire. The scent of hay and damp turf mingled with the faint smoke rising through the center of the room. The roof beams, possibly curved wood or whalebone, sealed the space, slowing heat loss while allowing warm air to rise gently through a vent. There were no sharp drops in temperature, no icy drafts, just a feeling of shelter that had been built, not imposed. This was how Vikings in Greenland did more than survive. They thrived for centuries in a landscape where others would have frozen. And perhaps most disturbing of all, this model of home building stopped being used just as the world began to get colder, during the onset of the Little Ice Age in the 14th century, which raises a powerful question. What caused the abandonment of this knowledge? When exactly was the balance broken? And why was no one ever taught how it worked again? Chapter 2. The invisible system that breathed warmth. Imagine a house that breathes, not as a metaphor, but in the most literal sense, a structure designed to allow air to move naturally, creating a constant cycle of circulation, thermal balance, and healthy humidity. No engines, no fans, no electricity, only dirt, stone, turf, and a deep understanding of the land. This is what the Vikings built in their Arctic longhouses, and for centuries, no one fully understood how they managed to do it. The key to the system lay in something that archaeologists overlooked for years: the narrow gaps between turf layers, the spaces between stones, and the subtle asymmetry of the building's layout. In excavations conducted in Iceland at places such as Stung and Eiríksstaðir, researchers discovered walls made from turf blocks laid in alternating directions. Between those blocks, they found thin layers of dried plant matter, moss or seaweed, inserted deliberately. These were not random inclusions. They formed a hidden network of air channels. Cold, dense air entered through small inlets positioned at floor level. At the same time, heat produced by the central hearth, a shallow pit rather than a chimneyed fireplace, rose slowly and traveled upward through the inner wall cavities. As the warm air reached the roofline, it found a controlled exit, often a simple stone lid or a wooden flap that could be adjusted by hand. The result was a natural convection cycle, active day and night. This flow did more than keep the house warm. It stopped condensation. It allowed smoke to escape without sharp drafts. It maintained a humidity level that prevented dry air from causing health issues, a known problem in Arctic climates where modern heating systems often lead to nosebleeds, skin cracking, and respiratory infections. In a controlled experiment conducted by the National Museum of Iceland, researchers reconstructed a Viking-era turf house and monitored its interior climate. With just a small fire lit for 3 hours each day, the temperature inside remained stable between 16 and 18 degrees Celsius, even as the outside temperature dropped below -20. More impressively, the relative humidity stayed constant with no need for artificial humidifiers or sealed insulation. But there was something even more astonishing. The walls were not airtight. In fact, Vikings deliberately avoided sealing their homes completely. They understood that over-insulation would trap vapor from breathing, cooking, and body heat. By allowing slow, continuous airflow, they maintained a breathable balance. No mold, no rot, no suffocation. Today, this would be called passive design or bioclimatic architecture. But centuries before such terms existed, the Vikings had mastered it. And it worked so well that during the 19th century, Scandinavian engineers tried to replicate the concept in Arctic research stations. They failed, not because the system did not work, but because they could not reverse engineer its logic without understanding the materials, placement, and lived intuition behind it. The most unsettling conclusion reached by some of these engineers was that the system was too primitive to document. It depended on feel, on sound, on local knowledge passed from one generation to the next. It could not be standardized. Therefore, it was dismissed. But was it primitive, or simply too subtle for the modern mindset? How could something so simple outperform modern houses built with layers of chemical insulation, mechanical ducts, and thermostats? Because what made the Viking system revolutionary was not what it included, it was what it did not need. Why would a house that self-regulates without machines be seen as a threat to the modern world? Chapter 3. Life inside a living house. During the long Arctic winter, when the sun barely rises above the horizon and the night stretches endlessly, life inside a Viking longhouse was not silent. It was intimate, dense, and, in many ways, alive. Those turf walls were not merely structure. They were warmth, boundary, protection, and in a deeper sense, an organism woven into the life of the family it sheltered. Within one of these traditional homes, such as those documented at the Norse settlement of Lanso Meadows in Canada, or in archaeological studies from the Þjórsárvöllur Valley in Iceland, at least 3 generations lived under a single roof. Grandparents, parents, children, livestock, smoke, and vapor shared one enclosed volume of air. The house itself became a climate capsule, where every movement, every breath, every flame had thermal consequences. Reports from the Icelandic Archaeological Institute detail how Viking families shared space with sheep, goats, or cows during the coldest months. This was not a sign of poverty, but of efficiency. The body heat from livestock, combined with that of the people and the hearth, helped to stabilize the interior temperature. One adult cow, for example, can generate the equivalent of 400 watts of thermal energy. In an enclosed, well-designed space, that amount of heat could literally make the difference between survival and death. However, this thermal efficiency came at a sensory cost. The air, heavy with vapor from breathing, cooking, and sweating, became dense by nightfall. There were no glass windows. The small rooftop openings served not only to vent smoke, but also to allow for gradual oxygen renewal and carbon dioxide release. The fire was not kept burning all night. Coals were carefully buried in ash to retain warmth until morning. Light was minimal but sufficient. The glow of embers often provided the only illumination, occasionally aided by oil lamps made from seal fat. Smoke hung low beneath the beams, leaving behind a sour, darkened scent. Although modern medical studies confirm that prolonged smoke exposure could cause respiratory illness, it also had an antifungal effect. It helped prevent the spread of mold and bacteria in the damp interior. Cloth, hung to dry, absorbed the smoky smell of wood, animal fat, and boiled wool. The turf-packed walls released an earthy dampness that, in spring, mixed with the scent of thawing ground. The roof leaked slowly during the melt season, and families adapted, placing bowls, skins, or stones to guide the water away from sleeping areas. children slept beside elders, not out of sentiment, but to conserve body heat. Studies suggest that human body warmth alone can raise the temperature of a closed space by as much as 2 degrees Celsius per hour in the absence of active ventilation. Every body mattered. There was no privacy. But there was functional zoning. Beds were raised off the floor, built with dry moss, feathers, and animal hides. Cooking and sleeping areas were defined by habit rather than walls. Tools hung from wooden pegs. Oral stories shared around the hearth served not only as entertainment, but also as education, memory, and survival strategy. Some sagas were literal instructions for enduring winter. And yet, inside this seemingly simple house, the temperature remained constant. It did not fluctuate like the improvised shelters of later European settlers. There was no need to open or close windows. It was a silent, sensory, living technology. When 19th century explorers attempted to recreate these Viking homes, they failed. They did not know which materials to use. They did not realize that turf blocks must be cut in autumn while the root system is still alive. That the roof needed to be heavy enough to hold heat, but not so heavy that it collapsed in spring. That stone foundation served not only for drainage, but also for storing daytime heat. None of this was written. It was felt. It was observed. The Viking longhouse was not a building. It was an extension of the body, the family, the earth. It pulsed with life. And like any living thing, it withered when oversealed or abandoned. That is why, when modern societies began to build with concrete, metal, and rigid geometry, this knowledge faded. Not because it was inefficient, but because it was incompatible with a life disconnected from nature's cycles. How could something so effective be forgotten and later classified as military secrecy? Chapter 4. The Hidden Truth Among Lost Cultures. The most astonishing thing about the Viking thermal system is not that it worked, but that it was not the only one. All across the planet, ancient cultures that never communicated with one another reached remarkably similar conclusions. Heat without burning, ventilation without opening, construction without harming. Passive systems that mimic the respiration of the earth itself. And every one of them at some point was ignored or replaced by industrial methods that were less efficient but more profitable. In the highlands of Scotland, long after the Viking Age had ended, people built what were known as black houses. These were homes made of stone and turf, with low ceilings and no chimneys. Smoke from the hearth filtered slowly through the woven vegetation of the roof. This was no design flaw. It was intentional. The smoke acted as a natural antifungal agent. The walls, often over 1 meter thick, kept the interior warm during the harsh Atlantic winters. This building method persisted until the 19th century, when the British authorities banned it for being unhygienic, without ever testing its thermal efficiency. Thousands of kilometers away on the open plains of Nebraska in the United States, entire families lived in sod houses during the 19th century. These homes, built by settlers who lacked access to wood, unknowingly copied the Viking model: flat roofs, thick walls, natural ventilation. Some of these homes stood for over 100 years, surviving tornadoes, deep freezes, and summer heat. Most importantly, they operated with no external energy costs. In the mountainous regions of Iran and Turkey, small adobe homes known as beehive houses still maintain stable indoor temperatures year-round. Their rounded shapes, warm air rising to the domed ceiling, and the thermal mass of clay all follow principles nearly identical to medieval Nordic architecture. Even in the Siberian Arctic, nomadic groups built partially underground dwellings known as yarangas, structures covered in layers of hide and supported by whale bones. These homes functioned as microclimates capable of withstanding temperatures as low as -40 degrees Celsius. None of these buildings relied on industrial insulation. Instead, they used precise layering, body heat, and the thermal stability of the ground. So why did these systems vanish? Why are they not taught in architecture schools today? The answer lies not in science, but in economics. During the 20th century, as housing became industrialized and fossil fuel use expanded, a new model emerged. Build fast, build uniform, and build dependence. Every house needed to consume energy. Every resident became a monthly customer. Every wall became a product. In this system, a house that worked by itself was a threat. It did not create recurring profits. It required little to no technical maintenance. And worst of all, it could not be patented. A declassified report from Norway in the 1990s revealed that during World War II, Military engineers studied Viking turf houses in detail, hoping to adapt their design for Arctic military bases. The findings showed that with proper construction, fuel consumption could be reduced by as much as 70%. But the documents were never published. They were marked for internal civil defense use only. The same pattern occurred in Canada. In the 1960s, scientists from the National Research Council studied the L'Anse aux Meadows Viking homes. They found that the thermal performance of these structures outperformed modern prefabricated houses in cold climates. And yet, the data were never used in any major urban planning. The files were archived. This pattern repeats itself. Traditional knowledge is rediscovered, verified, confirmed, and then ignored. Or worse, dismissed as primitive. And yet, the evidence is still there. The houses are still standing, in Iceland, in Norway, in Scotland, still resisting time, climate, and cultural erasure. Because what the Vikings discovered was not just a way to survive the cold. It was a philosophy of construction, a universal principle. Heat is not something to conquer. It is something to manage. Air is not something to block. It is something to guide. The house does not fight nature. It speaks with it. What forced this global wisdom into silence beneath layers of concrete and artificial heating? Chapter 5. The forced silence of a system that worked too well. The world did not change all at once, but there was a moment, quiet, gradual, and irreversible, when human beings stopped building homes to live in and began building them to consume. Viking houses, those structures that regulated their own temperature without relying on external fuel, slowly disappeared. Not because they failed, but because they worked too well. During the 19th century, industrialization swept through Scandinavia. New cities were built using bricks, cement, and coal-fired heating systems. Housing became part of a linear economic model: prefabricated materials, centralized energy, constant maintenance. Homes were now boxes designed to be identical, fast to build, and profitable. In this system, a turf house with self-regulating airflow was not desirable. It was subversive. Modernist architects trained in institutions that dismissed oral knowledge and empirical craftsmanship began to ridicule traditional building techniques. They spoke of progress, hygiene, and efficiency, but beneath the surface, it was about control. A home that did not depend on an energy grid produced no monthly income. It required no specialized upkeep. It reduced consumer dependency. In the 1930s, as Europe prepared for war, Scandinavian military engineers revisited these ancient Viking techniques. According to classified reports from that era, several Arctic bases in northern Norway and Svalbard were built using principles inspired by turf construction: thermal mass roofs, convection-based airflow, multi-layered walls. These structures endured extreme winters using minimal fuel, but they were not made public. They remained in defense archives. After the war, the petroleum boom and the rise of domestic appliances sealed the fate of these passive systems. Companies supplying gas, electricity, and home equipment flourished. Houses became sealed units, entirely dependent on fossil fuels, synthetic insulation, and mechanical systems. So what happened to the homes that required no outside energy? They were labeled outdated, folkloric, irrelevant. Documents proving their efficiency were buried in technical libraries. Some universities even taught that turf houses were unhygienic without ever analyzing their internal airflow systems. It was a falsehood repeated until it became accepted fact. And yet something began to shift in recent decades. Climate crisis, rising energy costs, a new interest in autonomy and resilience. Suddenly, eyes turned back to the past. Today, it is scientifically clear. A home built with local materials, thermal mass, and natural ventilation can remain comfortable in winter without drawing power. Indoor humidity can be stabilized without machines. A house can breathe, like a forest, if it is built with knowledge, patience, and respect. But this rediscovery is not only technical, it is philosophical. It reminds us that complexity is not always progress, that the best solutions are often the ones buried beneath our feet, that what we abandoned in the name of speed and profit might have been wiser than we ever realized. The Viking method was not hidden because it was ancient or primitive. It was hidden because it undermined the logic of the modern world, because it showed that people can live well without constant consumption, without dependence, and without waste. And that may be its most uncomfortable legacy, A house built with earth and time can grant more freedom than 1,000 digital devices. But the final question remains. Can this knowledge be revived in the cities of today, or are we destined to forget it once more? For centuries, this knowledge survived in silence, not in books, not in blueprints, but in hands that knew how to cut turf with the roots intact, in eyes that watched how smoke curled inside a room, in ears that listened to the crack of distant ice and knew the house must adapt, not resist. The Vikings did not need theories of energy efficiency. They had observation, repetition, and respect for the land. And with those alone, they built homes that defied modern logic, structures that breathed, retained warmth without burning fuel, and cared for those within, generation after generation. Now, as we face a new era of energy instability, runaway urbanization, and deep disconnection from the environment, perhaps it is time to look back. To excavate not only the soil, but memory itself, because buried beneath layers of forgotten history lies a simple and powerful truth. Balance is not something imposed by technology. It is something built with wisdom. If you want to discover more about how the Vikings challenged climate, history, and our very assumptions about how we ought to live, keep exploring with us. The past is not dead. It is waiting for us to listen again.